Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Francis Schortgen, who is a professor of political science and international affairs and business at the University of Mount Union. Prior to going into academia, he worked in the business consulting industry in Seoul, South Korea. Welcome, Francis.
Thank you, Gil.
I want to start with your paper on North Korea, the political logic of economic backwardness in North Korea, in which you say, given the unsustainable nature of the North Korean economic reality, the present study lays the foundation for a critical inquiry into how and for how long North Korea's monolithic policymaking system can afford to resist the need for pragmatic economic reform measures, including possibly the adoption of a Chinese model of pragmatism, economic liberalization, and opening up. Could you talk a bit about maybe the sort of the history of North Korea and where they are today?
Sure. As a backdrop to that paper and why I asked the question, certainly I looked at the relationship between China and North Korea and how that has evolved over the years, certainly growing out of the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, when the relationship became sort of solidified. A relationship, one might argue, was sort of forged in blood and iron, as it were. And there was an ideological connection, certainly. And what I noticed, and other scholars certainly as well, I'm not by any means the only one who has picked this up, it's a growing disconnect, or there has been for a number of years, between North Korea and China. And it's certainly very stark when you look at the trajectory of economic reform and development. As a matter of fact, it was interesting to see that early on, North Korea, in terms of economic development and per capita income, was slightly higher than China. And this sort of was maintained until about the early late 1980s. And then you began to see a fundamental divergence when China really doubled down on economic reform and restructuring in the early 90s. And so that got me to ask this question: why a country that is really as closed off as North Korea is today has not been able, or willing for that matter, to learn from its neighbors, whether that be South Korea, where there's definitely the historical, the language, the cultural connection, or for that matter, Japan or China. So North Korea is a unique place in the sense that it could look in any direction and see examples of economic development success that it could emulate, maybe to some degree, not necessarily lock, stock, and barrel. But then it raises also the question as to why they haven't even been willing to learn from China. Over the years, certainly under Kim Jong-il, when the few times that he visited China, the Chinese authorities were always very keen to showcase special economic zones, and it was sort of an indirect way to nudge him in the direction of gradual opening up and economic reform. course, that hasn't really worked. And so that got me to look into this and whether or not there was really that political logic behind it, that they just maybe are not willing to open up, because what it means for them is that when they change course economically, it would be an acknowledgement that the policies that the government had put in place before would have been wrong. And for a regime that is so keen on maintaining absolute dominance and basically coming across as knowing everything, that would be a very astonishing, acknowledgement for sure.
To set the context, I was looking at the chart that you have in the gross domestic product, and I don't know exactly what the y-axis might be, but it is so currently the GDP between North Korea and China is about 3 orders of magnitude different. Yeah, am I reading it correctly?
I would have to look at my own chart here again just to. But there was definitely a very significant divergence, because I had 2 charts, and I think one might have been on the logarithmic scale.
Yeah.
So that's where it was a little more difficult to see.
Yeah, so about, you said it's about 10 trillion, which seems, these are 2014 numbers. China has gone further than that. But 10 trillion in China GDP, and North Korea's GDP is about 1,000th of that, which seems makes intuitive sense, I think.
Yes.
But more importantly, as you point out, North Korea's GDP hasn't grown for nearly 50 years, which is an incredible thing to see. And so, those are the numbers. And, you say that North Korean regime's misguided focus on state building through Juche and Sungun. Juche is a self-reliance strategic component, Sungun, the military first strategic component. Those policies actively paved the way for development and underdevelopment and systematic dissonance. And so I guess North Korea had 3 leaders, right, since 1980s. Is that right?
Since Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and then currently Kim Jong-un. Yes.
Okay. And what is the sort of the policy differences between them, or was there any?
Initially, I don't think there was a lot of difference between Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the father and the son. But what we noticed in sort of the latter years of Kim Jong-il was that there was some experimentation with not exactly market reforms, but there was a loosening of some of the regulations. Some people were allowed to sell their excess goods at market prices. There was an attempt at a currency reform that didn't really work out. But as soon as it went a little bit out of hand, the government cracked down again. And so this is sort of similar to what we might have seen maybe under Mao Zedong in China, when the technocrats might have become a little bit too successful, then there was sort of a retrenchment of sorts. Where we were initially very hopeful was when Kim Jong-un took over. In one of his early speeches, he actually alluded to the fact that the North Korean people should not have to tighten their belts anymore, and they should enjoy the full benefits of their economic system. So it led a lot of people to think that maybe he could become sort of a North Korean version of China's Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader who sort of led China on the path to economic opening up and reform.
Right.
And those early hopes were certainly dashed. But nowadays, very recently, actually, in the last, I think it was the last week or the last 2 weeks, there was an acknowledgement by the North Korean regime that the current 5-year plan was actually not working the way it was supposed to, and that they might actually revisit that one at a party meeting in January. So that might be sort of a very subtle acknowledgement that they do recognize things will have to change. It could have been compounded, of course, by the COVID-19 pandemic, because North Korea, the limited exchange it has had with China, the economy right now seems to be a lot more closed off because the borders are very much closed right now. The North Koreans were trying really not to have cases of COVID-19 in the country. That doesn't mean, of course, that they don't have any, and they probably wouldn't acknowledge. Yeah. But the economy certainly has taken a hit, and trade.
Not a lot of data coming out. That's the problem, right? So
exactly.
So, if I remember correctly, Francis, that Kim Jong-un is Western educated guy, right? Did he have his education in Europe?
Yes, he was apparently at a boarding school in Switzerland for a number of years. And that exactly is what also led to some initial hopes that maybe that Western exposure might have rubbed off on him and might have sort of sown the seeds for a more reformist mentality.
Right. And those hopes were dashed quickly. And as you said before, they are sort of at the center. They can look in many directions and see what other countries have done. So you say in the paper, even if expectations of North Korea emulating the China model of economic development in its totality are misplaced, it's nonetheless reasonable to assume that the incontrovertible evidence of China's economic reform and development success since the early 80s would compel the North Korean regime to consider embarking on the path of an ideological and economic pragmatism and learn from China's economic reform measures in tangible ways. But it did none of that, right?
Yeah, well, at the very least, extremely little. They did have some examples of sort of special economic zones. One was on the border with China. And of course, we also have the Kaesong Industrial Park, which is a joint venture actually with South Korea. It is in the north. It is staffed with North Korean workers, but South Korean companies were locating some basic manufacturing there. It has since been closed again after all the tensions between the North and the South over a number of years. So there's not a lot of activity there, if any, right now. But in the North, we had some special economic zones on the borders with China and North Korea, but it was with Russia as well. But it was not on the same level as what you saw in China when they opened up with their Gaige Kaifang, the reform and restructuring policy in the late 70s, early 80s, the open door policy, really bringing and inviting foreign investors to set up shop. That kind of dramatic push has not happened on the same level in North Korea.
Yeah, and China, obviously, being close by, has a lot of interest in North Korea. But you say the conventional assumption that the China-North Korea relationship is anchored in a strong foundation of political and ideological perspectives, however, misses a larger point that beneath the surface of the alliance relations, the two countries share very few common interests. Could you expand on that?
Sure. I mean, on the one hand, a lot of people might say, well, there are similarities in terms of their political systems, communist or maybe more sort of Stalinist really in North Korea, but the ideology was similar. Central planning was a norm. So there should be enough of that common mindset and commonality for North Korea to look at. When you diverge from that, it doesn't mean that your political system necessarily unravels, because what the Chinese have been able to do up until now was certainly push economic reform and still maintain that political stability for the Communist Party. So if that was a concern for North Korea, the fear that once you open up, you open the Pandora's box, as it were, and economic reform could lead to political reform pressures, well, that hasn't happened in China. The case, of course, in North Korea might very well be that you have a family dynasty, essentially, and you have to rely on the support of the military. The military was vested in the system. And when you push for change, of course, all the vested interests, they might say, well, what is in it for me? Am I still going to maintain my interests? Is my situation going to increase? Am I benefiting more? Am I benefiting less? There may be that kind of hesitation for people to engage in something new where they don't know where exactly it's going to go.
What is that? Do you know this, Francis? What's the people strength of North Korean military in number of people? Do you know?
I think it's on the order of maybe about, and this is not a hard and fast number by any means, but it could be about 1.5 million, if not even closer to 2, if you counted the fact that everybody's virtually, or the males are virtually drafted into the military or might be in reserve. But it's a very large military in that sense.
Yeah,
not necessarily a very well equipped one by any means.
Yeah, so it's a significant percentage of the population, and so any changes you would try to make is going to be essentially you have to demonstrate that it is beneficial for the military. It sounds to me, right?
In many ways, that you have to give them some kind of assurance that there's something in it for them, or at least their situation, their economic situation, their benefits, the perks that they have gotten, that they would not be at risk. Because the moment, of course, that that's the case, then the military would be, or any entity for that matter, would not be in support of any reform that would be disadvantageous to them.
Yeah. And, there was some hope in 2011, you say in the paper, if the very real prospect of no longer being able to take unqualified Chinese support for granted, then perhaps the wave of revolutionary uprisings that engulfed much of Middle East and North Africa in 2011, combined with the death of Kim Jong-il in December 2011, would help to underscore the urgency for a new logic of economic development. But it really didn't do much at all, right?
Yeah, we only saw early on, as I mentioned before, that's when Kim Jong-un gave that one speech. I think it was in January of 2012, if I remember correctly, where he did sort of indirectly allude to the fact that he might push for economic reform or some building projects, which he has done.
Yeah.
But it's not exactly anything that benefits the population as a whole. I mean, when you build a ski resort, the poorest of the poor in the country, they don't benefit from it. If you build more apartment blocks, of course, in Pyongyang, which is where the elite lives anyhow, that may not trickle down to the rest of the country. So I think there's always a disconnect between certainly what's going on in Pyongyang and the rest of the country. And if the developments around 2010, 2011 with the Arab Spring, the death of Kim Jong-il gave rise to that hope that maybe change is afoot. Yes, those hopes were dashed. And there's no indication right now we see a sort of a dramatic change in that. There were instances where China has sort of very much signaled, and then China is basically the only lifeline, the economic lifeline that North Korea has today.
Yeah.
If China were to say or decide from one day to the next to cut that umbilical cord, well, then the North Korean economy would certainly implode. Of course, the Chinese are not going to do that, because if and when they were to do that, they would see a flood of North Korean refugees crossing the Yalu River into northeastern China, which is the Rust Belt of China. So there are a lot of socioeconomic problems there already. But the Chinese have on occasion sort of sent signals, especially at the height of the nuclear tensions on the Korean Peninsula, that they were not very happy with the direction that the North Korean regime was taking, certainly under Kim Jong-un, because under his rule, when his father died, we saw a dramatic uptick in missile tests, in nuclear tests, which raised concerns from a strategic and security point of view for China, because it would give the U.S. an excuse to relocate a lot more of their military assets in Northeast Asia under the pretext, of course, that they would be directed at North Korea and meant as a deterrent factor. But the Chinese would, of course, also realize that, well, there's nothing that would prevent those same military assets to serve as a deterrent to against China, of course. So that's where you saw that divergence of viewpoints, and the Chinese indirectly sort of signaled to the North Koreans that you cannot count on unqualified support for us anymore, because your actions actually sort of undermine our own national interests and potentially put all the gains that we have made, the economic gains, and then also the broader regional gains and the ambitions that China has in the region, they put that at risk. And so that's where you began to see sort of tensions emerge. And some people had described the relationship in very colorful terms, that it was a relationship as close as lips and teeth. So focusing on the ideological similarities, which are not there anymore. As a matter of fact, when China started embarking on economic reforms and then doubled down in the 90s and again in the 2000s, it became much more capitalist than it would ever be communist these days. North Koreans essentially looked at China as sort of having betrayed the ideological cause. In the major North Korean military academy in the early 2010s, according to some South Korean intelligence reports, there were even banners posted that basically labeled the Chinese as turncoats and our enemies, which is a very significant development.
Yeah, so I think you touched on this already. When Kim Jong Un took over, he started some sort of management programs, maybe because of his Western education, but there was nothing really there from an implementation perspective. So it sort of went back to how it used to be. And this idea of political independence, economic independence, and military independence as sort of the axes of strategy is really what they have been attempting to pursue, right? So I would imagine almost all the GDP is going into just protecting themselves from a military perspective.
To a large extent, that's probably still true. Yeah, there was a slight difference where under Kim Jong-il, you had the so-called Sungun policy, which was really the military first. So whatever limited resources you would have, the military would be first in line, and whatever scraps you had left over would be then used for other economic projects and so on. Under Kim Jong-un, we saw a slight change there. He talked about the Byongjin line, which essentially tries to have it both ways, where you focus on the nuclear program and on economic reform. But I think the balance is still skewed towards the military aspect a little bit more than the economic one, for sure. Or if it is more or less equal, then it would be an example of mismanagement on the economic reform side, because we haven't seen that much progress. Now, there are people that have gone to North Korea. I was at a conference in Seoul on North Korean studies quite a few years ago, and there were other Western scholars as well who had a chance to go to North Korea, and they said, well, there are some changes afoot. You see more, building projects, but certainly mostly in Pyongyang again. It's that you see, massive infrastructure projects being implemented across the country, for that matter.
Right. Yeah, and as you say, they have an example very close by to learn from. But you say, contrary to North Korea's attempt to focus on economic and military development simultaneously, as you mentioned, China adopted a four modernization process, beginning with agriculture and subsequently expanding in stages into industry, science and technology, and military, without being unduly consumed by concerns over regime survival. And we'll talk more about China after this. It's sort of interesting, the path that China has taken. There are other countries who attempted that too, to have some sort of a strategic, systematic path to higher level of development. And for example, India had something similar, but China has done it much better than its democratic neighbor.
Mm-hmm. I think that
go ahead.
I think that's partly due to, well, the leadership that China did have under Deng Xiaoping, where you had, I mean, you need a visionary leader, somebody who's not necessarily too afraid to rock the boat or bring or push through some change. But the key for the Chinese success, of course, was they didn't just open the door completely and change the system entirely, lock, stock, and barrel from day one. What was really at the heart of the Chinese system is really that pragmatism.
Yeah.
You try something new and then you test it first on a smaller scale, which is where their special economic zones came in. And I guess that is what the Chinese wanted to bring across to the North Koreans. As I mentioned before, when Kim Jong-il would go to China, the Chinese authorities always took him to special economic zones. There were even pictures where he was touring the financial district in Shanghai, or some of the special economic zones and special technology development zones on the outskirts of Shanghai, and with the backdrop of the Shanghai skyline, the Pudong area. And the message was always very clear from the Chinese side. This is what you can also achieve. If we pulled it off, you could do that as well. But the difference, I think, for the longest time was Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, certainly was no Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah.
So the Deng Xiaoping had that mindset. He had these famous sayings that it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat.
Right. Yeah.
You cross the river by feeling the stones. So it was a slow but deliberate process.
Right.
And I think the longer that North Korea would sort of put it off, the more difficult it's going to be to push through meaningful economic reform, because anything that you push through when you do it belatedly is not going to reap the benefits that you think it will have.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it underscores the importance of leadership, right? So I want to jump into a book chapter that you have on China, Taking Center Stage, China's New Role of Assertiveness in the 21st Century International System, in which you have a quote from President Xi. It says, "The tomorrow of the Chinese nation can well be called, a time will come to brave the wind and ride the waves. Since 1840, we have struggled continuously and have unfolded a brilliant prospect for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation in the territory of China." And he says all of us feel that we are closer to this objective of this rejuvenation of the Chinese nation at any other time, more than any other time in history. So, and then you talk about, again, sort of the history of China, the leadership. And this is a very, very strategic, deliberate process that China has gone through over 40, 50 years, right, to get here.
Yeah, and some people would, of course, say to come back to what you had mentioned before on the previous paper, the four modernizations that China has had. So that was it was very strategic, but you focus, with you start with agriculture, and then you focus on this sort of on manufacturing, and then on science and technology, and then the military. So there was a logic behind it. And this other paper that you referred to here, I should highlight that it's not in print yet. It will be in an upcoming book that will be coming out later this year.
Okay.
And the whole message here is that, yes, China is sort of reclaiming it's what it sees as its rightful position in the world. And that this comes back from that mindset of having been, the Zhongguo, the Chinese term for China, Middle Kingdom. So where China for the longest time was sort of seen as the center of the universe. And you look at the pronouncements that the Chinese leadership has now when they talk about a Zhongguomeng, or a China dream. So, it's the China dream on two levels, depending on how you interpret it. Some people actually translate Zhongguomeng as Chinese dream, which then would mean it's a dream for the average Chinese person, that my situation in life is going to improve. I climb up the socioeconomic ladder. I will make it into the middle class. I will have my, the Chinese version of your your house with the garden fence and the dog and so on, kind of like a Chinese version of the American dream, if you will.
Mm.
And then other people have said, yeah, but it's also the China dream. So that's the dream of the Chinese nation. And this is where Xi Jinping, the current president, talks about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And what he's actually referring to then, and that date that he also goes back to, the 1840s, that is really when China saw a dramatic decline.
Yeah.
When it lost a number of conflicts with the British, the so-called Opium Wars. Then there was a conflict with Japan in 1894-95 that it lost. It saw territory being occupied and then being given for 99 years, or released rather for 1990 years by the British, Hong Kong and the whole Kowloon Peninsula, Macau. And it's that kind of national humiliation that the Chinese are constantly talking about, the Ainian Guochi, 100 years of humiliation. And they are very committed on the back of sustained economic growth and development now to say, we will reclaim our rightful place. We will not be pushed around anymore. And so in that chapter, when I say sort of taking center stage again, the whole idea of that chapter, and it's a contribution to a volume that looks at national role conceptions, how countries perceive themselves in the international system.
Yeah.
So I argue in that China is laying the foundation for taking on a much more assertive role and potentially challenging or rivaling the United States, because there is a significant shift in the distribution of wealth and power that has been going on for a number of years.
Yeah.
That shift is decidedly going back to Asia again. Now it's China that draws the attention now, but if you go back to the early 1800s, what you would notice is that both China and India combined accounted for the vast majority of the global economy, and that is the trajectory that the world seems to be on right now. Now, China is ahead of India in that sense, but all the projections point to that. I think by the year 2050 or so, that India might really sort of catch up and maybe be number 3, if not already number 2, and then the US would again be relegated to number 3 position.
Yeah, so going back to China, Francis, so you have 3 stages of sort of evolving China. You call it role taking, which is about 2002 till about 2002, role bargaining till about 2012, and then role making after that. So one of the things I find extremely interesting, early on, they had what you call a 24 character strategy. And it says, observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities, and bide our time, be good at maintaining a low profile, never claim leadership. And so, I'm not sure if we can attribute to any other country to this sort of deliberate strategy that extended over a 30-year time period.
Exactly, and this is why it's also quite important to whenever you study countries, and certainly when it comes to China, to really understand sort of the very rich history and the strategic thinking that emanates from Sun Tzu and so on, because that influences very much how the Chinese have gone about it. So the 24 character strategy that you alluded to here, well, that was of course under Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah,
and you wanted to learn from the West. You wanted to catch up economically. You wanted to get out of the Maoist years and the socioeconomic dislocation in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. And so the name of the game was really catching up, but not rocking the boat. Essentially sort of flying under the radar. And this is also why they announced that the 4 modernizations and military was deliberately the last one. Now, when it comes to that, the role bargaining that you mentioned, China, or the role taking initially when China was still influenced by that 24 character strategy, Deng Xiaoping's thinking that you don't want to rock the boat, don't draw unwanted attention to yourself.
Yeah.
That's the way that you can expand your influence.
And they're growing. They're growing at 10% per year during that time.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the role bargaining that I talk about, that's more when sort of in the later in the 2000s, early 2010s, when China realizes that it has accumulated a significant economic clout already, and now combined with that mentality of sort of righting the wrongs of history, it wants to be seen as being given the respect that it deserves. So the role bargaining in a way was, yes, we will still rise peacefully. That was one of their slogans as well.
Right.
The 和平崛起, we rise peacefully. Don't worry about us. We are not trying to upset the international balance of power. We're not a revisionist power in that sense. We have no global ambitions, although that can certainly be debated. And then they shifted to peaceful development because they were so sensitive to the reaction that they got in the West when governments and also scholars and so on were a little bit more hesitant to just buy into this peaceful rise argument.
And so everybody started noticing it then, right? So you have a quote here from a Deputy Secretary of State, Robert Zoellick. In 2005, he says China is big, it is growing, and it will influence the world in years ahead. It's not a secret anymore, right? So for the United States and the world, the essential question is, how will China use its influence? And I guess in some sense, the Western strategy was to incorporate China into the Western sort of framework, or attempt to do that, right? And I don't know how successful that has been.
Not as successful as they would have hoped, for sure, because I guess they were in that sense more driven by this notion of modernization, economic modernization leading to political modernization and reform, so that China over time would become a democracy and then we don't have to worry about things. Of course, what we have seen in China is that economic modernization did not lead to political modernization or liberalization. That, I think, has then shifted the narrative a little bit, because that same Robert Zoellick, he had called on China to be a responsible stakeholder in the international system, which basically meant that, well, there are norms and rules of the game, and if you want to be an accepted player, we expect you to play by those rules. And I think this is where the kind of assertive China that we see now under Xi Jinping, definitely more assertive than previously, that China might be saying, well, yes, we still want to be a responsible stakeholder, but can we please also influence the system? Can we have a say in the rules and so on?
Yeah, and think about a well choreographed strategy. You say here, the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympic Games were China's coming out party. The event's official slogan, "One World, One Dream," was a thinly veiled attempt to assuage international concerns about China's rights and to project a purported commitment to international order. And so, it was a beautifully conducted Olympic Games, right? They demonstrated what they are capable of, and it's all in the context of what the West really understood.
Exactly, and then over time, what you see is we have the Belt and Road Initiative now as well, and again, this is sort of it's an economic charm offensive, if you will. Here I'm borrowing deliberately a phrase, a title of a book by Joshua Kurlansik, who wrote a book called Charm Offensive and about China, where they're literally sort of suggesting that we are trying to help connect countries, become part of the global economy. We help build infrastructure. And why should this be seen as anything other than just us being a responsible stakeholder in a way?
Right.
Of course, that push also has given rise to, well, concerns on the part of the West, because for one, I guess the West doesn't have a similar answer to that, certainly not on the scale that China's rolling out. Could be because the US may not have the financial means to do sort of a 21st century Marshall Plan, because that's what the Belt and Road Initiative is seen as.
Yeah.
And it's a way for China certainly to expand its influence, not just economically, but again, there's a strategy behind there as well, because China has been trying to, in its quest to be more of an equal participant,
right,
equal player, whether that's in international organizations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, where it was not treated even remotely equal, even though it was at one point when it was the third largest economy, or now, depending on how you measure it, it's either the second largest or the largest, if you use purchasing power parity basis data or not.
Yeah.
But the voting rights that China was granted were very much lower than the US. I think it was the US had about 12 or 14% of the voting rights, and China had about 3.5. So there's a huge imbalance there. And so what China was also trying to do was extend its influence through its currency, and it achieved some of that. I think it was in 2015, if I remember correctly, when the renminbi, or the Chinese yuan, was accepted in that basket of currencies based on which the special drawing rights of the IMF were based on.
Right.
It raised the profile of China, even in the financial sense. Now, with the Belt and Road Initiative, yes, China is building infrastructure projects, ports, roads, railroads, and you name it, power plants, dams. But at the same time, it's giving loans to those countries. And when it beefs up, when it helps those countries develop their economies, and it's now trading, it is also laying the foundation for trade flows to or the payments to be conducted in Chinese yuan. So it's internationalizing the currency on the back of the Belt and Road Initiative as well.
And I want to get your insights into this. So you say with the Belt and Road Initiative announced in 2013 and focused on increasing economic connectivity and meeting the infrastructure needs in much of the developing world. Now, I know that I don't know if this is part of the initiative, Francis, but China is also building a road to Pakistan.
Yes.
And so, underneath this is not just infrastructure. Presumably, it is it has military objectives as well, because we now see sort of an alignment, a sort of a different alignment, right? US, India, and others. And so, again, you have to really give it to them. This is a true strategic way of thinking about the country.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The China-Pakistan economic corridor, yes, it is partly about infrastructure, but at the same time, it connects them to the port of Gwadar, which the Chinese also have built. And that's, of course, there's strategic value there, because that port is one of a number of ports that China has been building or helped financing in the South China, South Asia region and Southeast Asia region, because they use a strategy called the string of pearls configuration. Interestingly enough, if you connect some of those dots, they sort of form a nice little ring around the Indian subcontinent. Yes, there is strategy there for sure. And you're quite right. The Belt and Road is not just about infrastructure. There is strategic purpose, because, and we have seen this in Sri Lanka, in the port of Hambantota, where the Sri Lankan government got a loan and the loan was probably way more than what the Sri Lankan government should have actually signed up for, because they were not able to repay it. And the Chinese have used a very interesting strategy there, then, where they say, well, loan forgiveness, no problem. But
give us
since we
support.
since we built the port, we now have control over it.
Right.
That has given rise to concerns about a debt trap diplomacy. And it has expanded all the way to Africa now, because this is also where China has a phenomenal footprint.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, you know more about this than I do. If you think about the Chinese strategy, maybe 10 years ago, you would have thought that, they're trying to lock up raw materials, oil production, essentially components of manufacturing. And as economies progress, that is going to be less valuable strategy. But that is not the case, right? So I want to get into your other paper, weaponizing globalization, Chinese high tech in the crosshairs of geopolitics, in which you say, in the tragedy of great power politics, John Mearsheimer states, although the intensity of their competition waxes and wanes, great powers fear each other and always compete with each other for power. And great powers are rarely content with the current distribution of power. On the contrary, they face a constant incentive to change it in their favor. And we are very much into this now, right? Very much a high-tech driven war between the US and China.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely unfolding, where people are talking about the emergence potentially of a technology Cold War. When you see how Chinese tech companies are being treated in their overseas ambitions, I mean, Huawei would certainly come to mind. And where this paper that you're referring to here also is coming out later this year in this is a 2-volume edition on Huawei in particular.
Right.
So Chinese overseas investments initiatives in the tech sector are definitely being very heavily scrutinized, for the simple reason that China is building up a significant, in some cases, an advantage actually, in the technologies of the future. And again, it's part of a dynamic that we have seen in a number of Asian countries, where you have call it a developmental state approach, which emanated in Japan. The Koreans adopted it, where the government has an active role to play in terms of developing the economy, identifying strategic industries that it wants to support with preferential loan guarantees and so on. And so the government, in this case, when it comes to the technologies of the future, has really sort of committed itself to ensuring that China is going to become not a leader, but the leader in artificial intelligence, robotics, autonomous vehicles, and so on. It's all part of that Made in China 2025 vision. You add to that their artificial intelligence blueprint, and it really seems to suggest that the Chinese are squarely focusing on securing sort of the high ground, or the commanding heights of the industries of the future. And this is where the competition is unfolding.
Yeah.
You now have Chinese companies going abroad, like Huawei, which is basically the #1 leader in terms of being able to build an entire 5G network. There's not a single American company that can build a full-fledged 5G network on its own. There's 2 European ones that can do it as well. So when Huawei, which ostensibly is a privately owned company, some people in the US are questioning it, because the head of Huawei used to be an engineer with the People's Liberation Army. So when they go abroad and they help countries build telecom networks, of course, there's some justification for raising concerns about national security. The question then is just, is this concern, whether it's on the part of the US or the West in general, overly politicized to the point where any kind of overseas expansion is, or any investment opportunity is overly politicized, and politicized in the sense of raising concerns about national security. we see that more and more. I mean, recently we've seen it with TikTok, and then now WeChat is in the news as well. And it seems to suggest that as China is becoming more competent in some of those industries, it gives the West a run for its money. It is competing effectively with the West. Now, is it fairly competing? That's a whole different question, because the government is certainly bankrolling a lot of this.
I mean, there is a, from my perspective, Francis, there is a difference between tactics and strategy, right? So,
absolutely.
It's all well and good, for the West to object to a company doing 5G. But what's more important is, Made in China 2025 initiative. It says it is going to focus on next generation information technology, high-end numerical control machinery and robotics, um, aerospace, maritime engineering, rail equipment. That's all fine, but also new materials, biopharmaceuticals. So these are, sort of the industries. For example, the U.S. believes it has a lead, and it's essentially saying, yeah, we're going to take all of these industries, not take, but we're going to lead in all these industries. So that strategic initiative, it's okay to have strategy, but the country has already shown it's immensely capable of implementing strategy, and it has very competent leaders, juxtaposed with, I would argue, complete incompetence in some of the large democratic countries. We are probably looking at this trend accelerating a lot faster than even China wanted.
That's probably true, and it raises sort of broader questions also about education systems. If we look, for example, in the US, but it's also happening in Europe and in Australia, if you look at graduate programs in the fields that you would source human talent from to contribute to those industries of the future, you would see a veritable army of foreign students. Most of them from probably China, and then the second largest would be India, and there's South Koreans and so on. And so in the past, if the US or some European countries are now worried about China's technological prowess, we also need to be doing probably a little bit more soul searching and look at immigration issues, because we had students, foreign students, that would come to the West and study. We give them the skills, and so we basically educate our own future competitors in a way. So should the West have a discussion, maybe in particular, since we're sitting here in the U.S., a discussion also about how about harnessing that power, that brain power, and making sure that it's not sort of a brain circulation, but more of a brain gain for countries like the U.S. if students decide to pursue their graduate studies here. And what we're seeing now, of course, is that we close the door more and more to students, again, on national security grounds as well. In some areas, specifically, Chinese students are not allowed to deal with certain technologies anymore. And that, again, just sort of doubles down on China's efforts. It makes them more determined to achieve in their own country, potentially, those educational, or to overcome those educational hurdles and cultivate that human talent even at home. So we have to look at it not just as sort of it's a deliberate strategic move. It's China has ulterior motives, but what are we also doing on the human front in terms of instilling in our people the skills of the industries of tomorrow?
So my instincts are slightly different, Francis. So I want to get your perspective on this. I still believe open borders, anything that you do on the people side, US almost had a monopoly on essentially going out to the world and collecting the best graduate students for a long time.
Hmm.
And closing the door on that, I suspect is going to hurt us more than otherwise.
Absolutely.
Um, I also believe that, so for example, this podcast, there are only two countries that this podcast will not be heard. And I don't know what the reason is, and it's North Korea and China. And so the competition is, I believe, is really in information and any strategy. Even though China has been quite successful in the first two stages, where they had a very deliberate way to get to, let's say they got to a $10,000 per cap GDP, and the US is at $100,000 per cap GDP. So there's just still an order of magnitude difference there.
Hmm.
But to go from 10,000 to 100,000 is going to require, I believe, for China, a very, very different strategy than they have been pursuing. At least that's my instinct.
And I would not disagree with you on that. Absolutely. And if I may sort of put a sort of a personal anecdote in here, I have lived in Asia and even studied there. And what I noticed over the years when I was in Singapore, you have a lot of Northeast Asian, well, Singapore is in Southeast Asia, but in a lot of those countries, you have an education system that was more predicated on memorization, rote learning,
Yes. Yeah.
not a lot of out of the box thinking, innovation, creativity. And what I have noticed is that in some places, it's not really widespread yet.
Mm.
It was telling nonetheless that at a time when in the US we haven't thrown it by the wayside, but we have moved a little bit more into sort of the pre-professional focus, maybe downplaying the liberal arts a little bit more, which, where we got a lot of that creativity and innovation from. I mean, even Fareed Zakaria wrote about this in Defense of Liberal Education.
Yeah.
Then when I spent time in Asia, in South Korea, in Seoul National University is focusing a little bit more on liberal arts now. Todai, Tokyo University in Japan, has embraced some of it. Yonsei University in Korea. Beta, I think Peking University has done some of that. In Singapore, the National University of Singapore has a joint venture with Yale University, a Yale NUS college, which is the first full-fledged liberal arts college. So what
Yeah.
we're seeing throughout Asia is a recognition that, yes, you can get up to a certain level, but then to really sort of harness the full power of creativity and innovation, something else in society has to change. And
That's
so
right. Yeah.
it might still take a while, but I think they're laying the foundation to some extent. And China might be a little bit behind there, so it's not going to be a very smooth, upward trajectory in terms of getting to that same level that the US is at. But you see some more of their universities becoming more well known. Tsinghua University is it's more competitive to get into than even MIT these days, and it's a first-rate university in science and technology already. But they still have a long way to go. So I fully agree with you on that. It's one thing to get from basically 0 to 10,000. It's going to be a very different ball game to get to 100,000 for sure.
Yeah, and it may not be just China, Francis. I had my undergraduate education in India, and this is another example of an education system that produces a large number of engineers and doctors, but very little, I would say, in terms of fundamental innovation.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the exact reasons for it. I believe it is related to the education system, as you mentioned. It's related to sort of the lack of flexibility, early specialization. There could be a variety of reasons around it. And as you say, it's not very easy to change quickly. And so the next competition that all these countries are looking forward to, I think it's a very, very different competition than they're used to, which might give which might give us a little bit of an extra time, provided we have competent leaders, which seems less likely. But if that's the case, we have a little bit more time to do that. And you can see this in the micro level. measuring just R&D investment in aggregate, it doesn't really correlate with innovation.
Hmm.
You can look at in companies, large companies spending a large amount of R&D money. They might get a bunch of patents and all of that. But at the end of the day, you have to ask, what is that fundamental innovation that they brought forward? And you can find very little in companies that invest a lot.
Hmm. That's true. And there's actually a very interesting publication I read on this as well that touches on all those challenges, even for the U.S. as well. In terms of innovation, do we have a full-fledged national innovation policy? I mean, we have some aspects of it, but it's not on the same level as, say, South Korea would have it, or even China for that matter.
Yeah.
The study is a little dated. It's from the early 2010s, I think, and it's called Innovation Economics. And it paints a little bit more of a, I wouldn't say a truly pessimistic picture, but it raises questions even about where the US is going. But even if we have a little bit of more time, that should still give us pause and say, okay, we need to recognize where the challenge is coming from, what the challenge is going to look like, and we should use then today's situation to prepare us for the future.
Right.
I think if all we do is we seek solace in the fact that we can keep, in this case, Chinese companies from our shores, or we make it difficult for them to acquire American or European companies, that gives us a certain degree of short-term comfort, but doesn't prevent the ultimate competitive dynamic that's going to come down the pipeline.
Yeah, so let me ask you that, Francis, in conclusion. From a U.S. policy perspective, there are a lot of moving parts here. But what would be, sort of the 1, 2, 3 areas that you will focus on for the next 5 to 10 years for the U.S.?
I mean, for one, then this would probably be the number one issue would be that we can't have the policy that we have right now of sort of deliberately steering a confrontational course and being much more protectionist. We need more cooperation and coordination or consultation.
Yeah.
Than potential confrontation, because it seems that we are on that track right now.
Right.
The foundation for that, actually, even in the Bush administration, under our former Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson, when we had a sort of an annual meeting, it was called the U.S.-China Strategic Economic Partnership. And I think that was a great initiative, at least, even if it's of rival geopolitical powers or competing powers. Competition is good, certainly in the economic realm, even in the technology realm.
And it's not a zero-sum game, right? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
Because it keeps you on your toes. It gives you that added motivation to look over your shoulder and not take for granted that, well, we were number one, we will always be number one, because that's never going to happen, because the world is too dynamic. So yes, it's not a zero-sum game. We have strengths that the Chinese don't have. They have strengths that we don't have. There's actually areas where we could cooperate.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, if you look at the global economy, it is going to be anchored not just in around one economy, but it's going to be, as some people call it, the G2, China and the United States. So it's incumbent on, for the sake of the global economic health, for those two economies to cooperate more, or at least have a productive dialogue. And I think we got off on the wrong track there in the last couple of years, unfortunately, and we need to get back to that. So that would be my first one. And at the more sort of societal level, and this would apply to every country, we need to really make sure that our future generations, or the ones that are in college now, especially in the US, will cultivate really a global mindset, so that they can see the challenges and the opportunities that are out there overseas, so that we have cultural exchanges, student exchanges. We need more of that, not less.
Because our markets, in the grand scheme of things, our markets are going to be small percentage-wise in the future.
Yeah.
And so it's if I could add one, the part of the number one that you mentioned, I think we need some way to have a consistent policy that spans administrations, right?
Yes.
The administration doesn't change in China. That is a problem. They have to ultimately get to democracy, we hope. But in the U.S., we need a consistent policy that spans administrations, because this is not a short-term thing. It's a real long-term strategic question for both countries.
Exactly, and that's the problem. Unfortunately, when our policies are very short term, they're driven by electoral cycles more often than not, and we have seen this under the Obama presidency. We had a Trans-Pacific Partnership that was negotiated with a lot of Asian countries. They stuck their neck out, gave us concessions, especially Vietnam and Japan.
Yeah.
Trump administration comes in, and we basically tear it up. So we need something that's more predictable, more consistent in the long term, because if there's too much uncertainty and unpredictability, not good for building a long-term relationship with anyone, and certainly not with the second largest economy in the world.
And it's just not policy, but also companies making investments. If everything changes every 4 years, nobody can make any investments, for the long term.
Exactly. So if we see sort of the longer term picture, and always for every decision we make, we actually look at what are the intended and unintended consequences. And if I may close on this note as well, the news that came out today about WeChat and how the U.S. is going to crack down on WeChat. Well, is that just going to be in the United States? What about American companies who are in China, and they rely on WeChat? Because if they're now being penalized, then that could very well undermine their position in the Chinese market, because WeChat in China is sort of like a Twitter, Uber, Amazon, Facebook, and some other social media outlets that we have in the US combined in one. So we may not have thought about the broader implications of that initial policy, and how it might actually undermine our own economic interests in terms of our company interests in China as well.
Exactly. Yeah. This has been great, Francis. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.